Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. That's right, just like it says in the intro, I am Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. So happy to have you here joining me this evening. First off, I want to wish everybody a Happy New Year. This is New Year's Eve. It is the first day of 2024 tomorrow, and I don't know about you, but for me, 2023 was kind of a bear of a year, so I'm looking forward to the fresh start. Speaking of bears, in case you've been having a tough holiday season, or 2023 was a tough year for you too, I'd just like to quickly remind you right here up front of the free 3-digit number 988 that you can call anytime 24 hours a day to receive counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So should you find yourself in a dark place, please do call 988, and please do remember that you are loved and the world is a better place with you in it. Alright, so you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, of course, but also to part 2 of a mysterious skull in the Islip woods. That's right, I said part 2. So if you haven't heard part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. And if you're all caught up and ready to rock, I would only remind you briefly where we left off when we were last together. Detectives Roddy and Murray were discussing how the murdered woman's killer seemed to have left a plethora of clues behind, the opposite of the usual problem. In fact, there seemed to be so many clues that the detectives weren't exactly sure where they ought to begin, or I should say continue, their investigation. Alright, with that, please do join me now as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies, a mysterious skull in the Islip woods, part 2, starts now. When we first got this case, it looked like one of those impenetrable mysteries, Murray said to me, but we seem to be burdened now with a wealth of clues. Hard to know just which one to tackle first. Just then the train stopped at Rockville Center and passengers filled the seats behind and ahead of us. It was impossible to talk over the case then any further. However, as the train hurled itself through the gloom of the rainy dusk, I pondered over our treasure trove. The abundance of clues was suspicious. Why should a murderer, after luring his victim to such a desolate spot, leave so many obvious clues behind him? If the object had been robbery and he'd been scared off by hearing someone approach, would he not have returned for his ghoulish loot? It was not likely, on the other hand, that a woman would be wandering about the scrub oaklands unaccompanied. However, speculation at this stage of the case was useless. The various departments at police headquarters would receive their respective items to be worked over, and my chief would direct me as to which step I would take next. Königstrasse, Altona, was the address on the label which I'd cut from the neck of the dead woman's coat. This was evidently some small place in Germany. Headquarters would get in touch with the German police, sending them a full description of the case and requesting information. The Missing Persons Bureau would trace their records for the reported disappearance of a woman within the past year, which might correspond with the one given by the undertaker. The Identification Bureau would trace the watch repairers whose marks were on the little Swiss timepiece, and circularize all dentists of the better class, giving a description of the dental work found in the skull. Another department would trace the owner of the New Jersey car. The silk-hatted Romeo of the lunch counter, I noted, changed cars at Jamaica and crossed over to the train on the other side of the platform, which carried passengers to a Brooklyn terminal. Murray and I followed suit, as it was the most direct way to get back to headquarters. At Flatbush Avenue, we bumped into him as he started to cross over toward the subway, and when we entered the same train, he was obviously nervous. However, at Brooklyn Bridge Station, Murray and I changed to a local. The last I saw of him that night was his face peering anxiously through the window. We turned in our reports, and I was just about to leave for home when I decided to clear up at least one item. It would not take long to find out from the Missing Persons Bureau if they had anyone on the list whose description fitted that with the blonde unknown. I found Captain Ayers, the chief of the bureau still at his desk. Briefly, I explained the Islip case to him. After consulting his files, he told me he had a record of no girl missing for a year that fit the description I gave him. I called it a day and left for home. When I reached headquarters the following morning, I was instructed to go over to Newark and interview Mrs. Henry Warehuff, or her husband, who was registered as the owner of the car which had stopped in Mr. Daly's office. Tom Murray had been sent back to Islip on another angle of the case. On a mystery of this sort, not one, but dozens of men are set to work, and it is largely a matter of luck as to who's going to be the hero that solves the caper. Each man travels along the line mapped out by my chief. He may find that it leads off on a wild tangent, or that it steers him straight toward the goal. This particular morning, I found myself on good ground. The address in Newark proved to be a handsome home in one of the best residential sections of the city. A neatly clad maid answered my ring. When I asked whether Mr. or Mrs. Warehuff were at home and informed her that I came from police headquarters in New York, she shrank back in alarm. I took advantage of the open door, however, and brushed my way in. "I think Mr. Warehuff is in himself, sir," she gasped, still regarding me with large, frightened eyes. "Will you please be seated in our library?" indicating a large, luxuriously furnished room on the right side of the hall. "And then I'll see if he's really in." I heard her footsteps patter off into the distance. I didn't have to wait long. Before a minute had passed, a tall, well-groomed man of 50 entered the room. "You've come about Anna Luther," he said without unnecessary preamble. "I mean, you are on that Islip murder mystery case, are you not?" I nodded. "Well, I was just writing a letter to New York Police Headquarters when you arrived." "Then you recognized the clothing and the trinkets," I remarked rather unnecessarily. The man had stopped speaking as if waiting for a lead of some sort. He nodded. "My wife and I believe they belonged to a maid we employed here a little over a year ago. She was a very superior sort of person, quite above her position. Although she never said very much about her family, we understood that they were well-to-do people who lived in Altona, a suburb of Hamburg, Germany." Mr. Warehuff moved restlessly about the room as he talked. After lighting a cigarette, he continued, "You can understand," half shrugging his shoulders and tensing his lips in a perplexed sort of way, "our reluctance to become mixed up in a murder case of this sort, and I hope that you will do everything possible to protect us from the publicity." After I'd reassured him on this point, he went on. "When Mrs. Warehuff and myself saw the description of the clothing and the jewelry found by the police in Islip, we recognized it. The initials A.L. sort of clinched the matter. To make it sure, we at once went over to the Long Island and visited the undertaker's establishment." "You say this Anna Luther worked for you as a servant until a little over a year ago?" I asked. "Not exactly as an ordinary servant. She was more of a useful companion to my wife. She left us to get married, and at the time she promised to come and see us on her return from honeymoon, which she was to spend in Germany," he explained. "Did you ever see the man she married?" "Yes," he readily replied. "A tall, dark, rather foppishly dressed person who was addicted to a tall silk hat, striped trousers, and a cutaway coat." Subconsciously, I thought of the lunchroom Romeo. "This man, he claimed to be an architect, but he was rather vague about his connections. Besides, I noticed he had hands of a working man. I'm rather interested in hands. I always noticed them particularly. This man's hand had a peculiar fingertips, rubbed smooth sort of, if you know what I mean." "What name did this man go by?" "Mueller and Miller. He used both. He said his right name was Mueller, but that he used Miller because Americans found that the German form was rather difficult to pronounce. I thought this was rather odd. I tried to convey my misgivings about the fellow to Miss Luther, but she was infatuated with him, and she wasn't the sort of young woman who you could just easily influence." I described the man in the lunchroom and asked Mr. Warehuff if he thought he might be the unfortunate girl's fiancé. "That is possible," he admitted. "If you like, I'll have another run over there and have a look at him. Although we don't want to necessarily get mixed up in this, we're still very fond of Miss Luther. And if there's anything we can do to help, we shall be very glad to do it. We have a photograph of the girl if that will help you any." I assured him that it would, very much. He went to a desk which stood by the window and, opening a small drawer, took out an ordinary cabinet-sized picture. "Ah, yeah, here it is. And it is fairly like her, though it makes her look more buxom than she was, and really does not do her justice. She had very beautiful hair which was the color of corn silk, and waved naturally. Her eyes were a deep sapphire blue, and her complexion was naturally pink and white." Putting the picture in my pocket, I thanked Anna Luther's former employer, and reminding him of his promise to give the lunchroom man the once-over, I departed. I went back to the police headquarters and wrote out my report. Visiting the Rogues Gallery, I looked over the collection which represented professional he-vamps who specialized in duping servant girls. An extraordinary assortment there. All types were represented. One, under the name of Fritz Scharferlein, occupation cabinet maker usually employed in piano factories, bore a striking resemblance to the description given by Mr. Warehuff of that of the lunchroom cashier. This man had been sentenced to Sing Sing 12 years before for bigamy and larceny, although the sentence called for 17 years. It had been later reduced to 5. As Scharferlein's case had been a very ordinary one, few details were given. A complete history could be found in the district attorney's office, however, and, making a note of this man's name and number, I filed it away for future use on the chance that collaborating data might come in linking this man with the murder of Anna Luther. At the time I was engaged principally in the fingerprint department, and during the next few days I was kept busy on other cases. 2 weeks later, Captain Coughlin again called me in on the Luther case. "We've received full information from the Hamburg police on the Islip murder," the captain said, tapping a sheaf of papers on his desk. "It seems that this man Mueller represented himself as a piano manufacturer to the woman's parents. Said he'd bought a site on Long Island and intended on building a factory there. They gave him most of their savings, which were considerable, and also several presents. Among these were 2 valuable police dogs." "I'll bet the man is Fritz Scharferlein, who was sentenced for bigamy 12 years ago," I exclaimed. My hunch had come through. The captain looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I explained briefly my hunt through the rogues gallery. "Well, I'll put men on the trail through the piano factories in Long Island and New Jersey. Have the photographer run several copies of Scharferlein's picture." The next few days developed nothing of importance. They were filled with ordinary routine work. Men, provided with a complete description of Mueller as furnished by the Warehuffs, scrutinized the employees of every piano factory on Long Island and New Jersey. Others visited the immigration officials and interviewed the cab drivers of Hoboken, where the ocean liner on which the honeymooners were supposed to have returned had docked. There were naturally scores of men who resembled the general description of Mueller, and each of these was thoroughly investigated. Tediously, tirelessly, the manhunt proceeded. German police dogs were not so common in those days as they are now, and I had an idea that we might be able to trace Mueller through the 2 which he'd brought over. The chief gave me permission to take up their trail. Crossing to Hoboken, I made a thorough canvass of the taxi drivers and old cabmen, showing each a photograph of Scharferlein and the unfortunate Anna Luther. Toward the late afternoon of the second day, 10 days after the discovery of the skeleton in Islip, I was just about to return to New York when a dilapidated closed cab rattled over the cobblestones and stopped in front of a German beer garden on the waterfront. 2 men got out, paid the fare, and entered the place. In hunting criminals, you never know in what guise luck may come along, so before the cabbie had a chance to whip up his horses and depart, I stopped him. "You remember picking up this man and this woman about a year ago?" I asked him. He stared at me blankly. Then his weather-beaten face wrinkled itself into a mass of crisscross furrows. His little bleary eyes buried themselves in folds of flesh. He guffawed loudly. "Ha! Say, what do you think I am, a camera eye? Get off there, young fella." I flashed my shield. "Say, listen, I'm from New York Police Headquarters, and before you go any farther into convulsions, you might want to pay a little better attention," I growled at him. He straightened up in a second. "This couple I'm looking for had 2 German police dogs with them." "Well, now you're saying something." He added a few picturesque swear words. "Let's have another look." "Ah, I remember the brutes all right." He squinted his eyes as he looked at the 2 pictures. "I couldn't tell you for truth if them were the couple. I didn't pay much attention to the lady, but as I remember she was pretty and blonde. The man, he looked older than that." "Where did you take them?" I asked sharply, cutting into his garrulity. "I was driving to Long Island City that day. I used to live there, in fact. And a man and a woman, they came along, and the man and the dogs got in me cab. The woman, she took a streetcar. I was told to drive to an address in Astoria, and there was quite a ways, and the man kicked about the bill and threatened to set the dogs on me. That's how I remember. This one looks like that man, but I wouldn't take my oath on it." "Do you remember the address in Astoria?" I asked him. No, he didn't remember that, he said, but he gave me some general directions that would lead me toward the poorer section. Taking down his name and address and handing him a tip, I left him and got back to headquarters as speedily as possible. There I laid the information before the chief, and he directed me to visit Astoria the next day and make a personal hunt for the dogs. "At the same time, you might want to look up this man Paul Gebert who lives in Astoria," he said, selecting one of the detective's reports which were lying on the desk in front of him. "He works in the Smith Piano Factory, and he went to Europe about a year and a half ago, according to the gossip." The next morning I called at the address on the Gebhard report. A small working man's cottage it was, with a handkerchief-sized plot of ground in front and a small backyard behind. A little boy in blue rompers was sitting on the stoop playing with a hungry-looking kitten. "Mother home?" I asked him. He looked at me solemnly without answering. I started to go up the steps. With a bound, he sprang to his feet and darted toward the rear of the place. I followed. "Ma! Ma!" he screamed. "There's a man here!" A neatly dressed woman of about 25 years of age opened the door and looked at me with a hostile eye. "Nah, he's at work," she answered sullenly. Then she quickly corrected herself. "I mean, he's gone away." "Where?" I asked. "I want to see him about his police dogs. I heard he had 2 fine specimens, and I'm looking to buy one of them." This was a long chance, but I wanted to see what the woman would do. She shrank back. "He ain't got no police dogs, and I don't know where he's gone. He's left me. 'Tain't the first time, but it's the last." In the small yard, I saw 2 large kennels. "What are these for, then?" I asked. But "Dunno," was the only answer I got. I wanted to see the inside of that cottage. I had a feeling that Gebert was there, so I used the old dodge and asked for a drink of water. Reluctantly, the woman entered the house. As she was about to close the door, I put my foot in the opening and followed her. Glancing swiftly about the spotlessly clean kitchen, my eye lighted on a dish towel. Momentarily, I lost my breath, for on the corner was embroidered the initials A.L. There was no longer any doubt that Gebert and Mueller were one and the same man. I accepted the glass of water and returned it to her empty. However, I put no more inquiries to the woman. I left her standing with the tumbler in her hands. From some children who were playing in a vacant lot, I learned that Gebert had taken his 2 dogs away a few days before and spent the rest of the day locating them in a private kennel some miles distant. They were ferocious-looking beasts, but they'd become somewhat tamed during their sojourn in America, and when I explained my mission to the keeper of the kennels, and my intention to hunt their owner by means of his dogs, he was obliged to give them into my custody. The newspapers had heard of the missing dogs, and they also had been searching the Long Island kennels for them. When we arrived in Astoria, a photographer caught sight of us and stopped the cab. "Hey there, Roddy, are those the missing dogs?" he shouted. "Yes," I admitted. "You can snap 'em if you want to." "I'd rather snap 'em where you're taking 'em." He grinned and accepted my silent invitation to jump into the taxi. "By George, they're the home kennels," he exclaimed. "Let's take a flash of them there." It was by then too dark to take a picture without a flashlight. We posed the dogs each near its kennel. Just before the flash exploded, I peered into the gloom. It seemed to me that I saw something lurking in the shadows. Then, there in the brilliant splash of light which followed, I saw Scharferlein, alias Bueller, alias Gebhardt. Before he had a chance to move, I was upon him. We had a pretty little tussle there in the yard, for he put up a stiff battle. Momentarily, I expected the dogs to join in and tear me to pieces, but the photographer, who was a pretty hefty chap, got a hold of them, and I managed to get my prisoner into the house safely. Within an hour, he was lodged in the Suffolk County Jail. For 2 days, he obstinately refused to talk. I was sure that he and Scharferlein were one and the same, but when we took his fingerprints, it was impossible to identify him. His work as a cabinet polisher had rubbed the papillary ridges almost smooth. This caused a smudged print which was useless for identification. The Wehrhuffs, however, identified him positively as the man who had married Anna Luther, and we could, of course, hold him on a bigamy charge. When we proved that he was a second offender, a mighty stiff sentence would be dealt to him. However, we weren't at all keen on complicating the murder charge with the lesser one of bigamy. That man was one of the hardest I ever met. We gave him a 3rd degree that would have frozen the blood of any ordinary mortal. Now, I don't mean that we beat him up. That would have meant nothing to a jackal of Gebert's type, but night after night and day after day, we took turns in questioning him. Coroner Savage dangled the gruesome skull of Anna Luther with its pitiful crop of flaxen hair before his eyes. Our evidence of his guilt was gone over and over again. The skeleton was finally lodged in the cell next to his. Around midnight of the 4th day when I was questioning him, he asked to see Coroner Savage. The coroner came over immediately. "Say," Gebhardt demanded as soon as Dr. Savage appeared, "can you get me a sentence for manslaughter instead of electrocution if I make a statement of facts?" Not the slightest trace of emotion sounded in his voice. He made the inquiry as casually as if he were discussing the sale of one of his dogs. "Well, you stand a much better chance," the coroner replied after a moment's astonished hesitation. "I can't promise you anything definite, but I'll do my best to mitigate the sentence. Besides, you owe it to your wife and children to take advantage of every opportunity for a lighter sentence than the chair." "All right," the prisoner replied carelessly. "I'm getting sick of this. I'll come through." The coroner called up Captain Coughlin, who arrived with Thomas Murray within a couple hours, and around 3 o'clock in the morning, Gebert made his ghastly statement. Here are his exact words as taken from the stenographic record. "About December 1907, I first met Anna Luther. We were married in February 1908. She went to Henry Wehrhuff's in Newark, New Jersey to spend a day or 2. On the pretense that I was going to rent an apartment for us to live in, I returned to my home and wife in Astoria. I met Anna Luther again on April 8th, and we went to an address on 34th Street, New York City, and from there we went to Jamaica. We stayed in Jamaica until the next day. April 9th, we went to Bay Shore and walked about, and I showed her some property I said I owned. I got into an argument with her about some money matters, and I turned and wanted to go back. She followed me up, screaming, and I shot her in the head. I didn't look at her, and I do not remember whether I shot her more than once. I remember after, I went to the Islip depot and took a train for home. It was nearly dark. On my way home, I threw the revolver out the car window. I want to state that I did not kill Anna Luther for her money, as the newspapers have stated. My original reason for marrying Anna was that I didn't care to be with my first wife any longer, but as she, my first wife, had given me a child, my desire to again see my child caused me to want to get rid of Anna and then return to my first wife and child. This is the reason that I shot Anna Luther, and I told her in Bay Shore that I was married and had a wife and must leave her. She screamed and ran after me and kissed me and wanted me back, and I shot her. This statement is made of my own free will without any hope of recompense being offered me. Signed, Frederick Gerhardt. Witnessed by John P. Coughlin, Acting Captain, Thomas Murray, William D. Roddy, Detective. Sworn to before me the 25th day of October 1909, Edward W. Bull, Notary Public. And you shot her when she came up to you and kissed you? Someone asked in a horrified voice. Yes, he answered impatiently. She told me she loved me and she kissed me. As she put her face up to kiss me again, I shot her in the head. A horror-stricken silence followed. Tell me something, I asked at last. Why did you leave the body with so many marks of identification upon it? Didn't you know that you would be traced through those? He considered the matter for a moment. Well, I did go back once or twice, he admitted. I went to the place where I shot her, but the body wasn't there. She must have managed to crawl along quite a bit before she died. The quite a bit proved to be a half a mile, when later we measured the distance between the point where she was shot and the place where the little Schmidt boy found the body. Although Gebhardt appeared to be brutally frank in his statement, he wasn't exactly accurate. Anna Luther had possessed a large sum of money which had disappeared. Her fine embroidered linens and much of her clothing were found in the Gebhardt cottage, where we also found the gun which the murderer had stated that he had thrown out the window. The jury who heard the case decided that there was no question of the cold-blooded monster's guilt, and 2 months later, he paid for his crime in the electric chair. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. Happy New Year, everybody.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.